much for taking the time, and apologies, I've got you out of bed to do it, and hopefully we'll make it nice and easy for you. We'll start at the very beginning. I mean, Frank Zappa. I mean, the first time I saw you mention that your first record that you bought was Yogi Bear and Friends, I think it was, and then the second was
Yeah.
was Frank Zappa. Now, Frank Zappa is obviously a little bit more complex than Yogi Bear, and maybe a little
Yeah.
bit more eclectic as well. So, what was it that drew you into Frank Zappa at such a young age?
The album cover.
Ah,
I was very young. I was obviously going from Yogi Bear to Zappa. There was a department store up the street from my house. And I remember I had to be a certain age before my parents would let me cross the main street by
of
myself.
course, yeah.
So the day that I was able to cross the main street, I went up and I loved music, obviously, and I saw the Zappa album cover for Freak Out. And I didn't really know Zappa. And I got the record and I listened to it, and I was stunned, and it was just so different. It was just like a wall of odd, beautiful sound. But I was very young, so I didn't really connect the artist,
Mhm.
Frank Zappa, with the record. I didn't really. And it wasn't until some years later that my friend turned me on to a Zappa song that it was from Bongo Fury. No, it was I think it was Uncle Meat, and the song was Electric Aunt Jemima.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then that started my real love affair with Frank's music.
That's where the connection came from. Excellent.
Yeah,
And then in terms of Frank, I mean, you actually got hold of his actual home phone number as well, didn't you, when you were a teenager? And you phoned it up expecting to speak to Frank. And I think it was his wife that you spoke to originally, but you kept
yeah,
calling and calling and things like that. And you eventually got to speak with Frank himself. He'd come back off the road or whatever. I mean, what do you
yeah.
remember about that conversation?
He was in a very good mood,
Ah,
and I was 18. And I was going to school at Berkeley, and I didn't even have a phone. I was using my friend's phone, and he was very nice. Oddly enough, when I think of what knowing Frank
hmm.
later, when I got to know him and work with him, I thought it was very odd that he took that phone call from me, because I was basically just like, yeah, I'm just a fan. But I knew that he was an Edgar Varese fan. Edgar Varese was a composer, and that he was looking for some scores. And it wasn't that easy to get scores back in those days, but the Boston Public Library had Edgar Varese scores. So I told him, hey, I've got some Edgar Varese scores I'd like to send to you, along with a transcription of some of your music, Frank's music, that I transcribed. And he gave me his home address.
Wow.
And I sent him that stuff. I did a transcription of the Black Page, and I sent him a tape of my band. I snuck that in there.
Of course.
And then I spoke to him again, and he was very, very positive about the tape and wanted to try me out for the band. But when I told him I was 18, he thought that was too young. But he was impressed enough with the transcription that I did that he hired me to be a transcriptionist. So I started to he started paying me, I think it was $5 a page, to listen to his music and write it down. And he
Phenomenal.
sent me, yeah, he sent me a big giant score called Mo and Herb's Vacation, and also the actual music for the Black Page, with a note that asked me to play it as fast as I can. So I made a tape of myself playing the Black Page, and I sent it to him. And the next thing I knew, the next time I had called him, I caught him in not such a good mood. And if Frank didn't want to talk, I mean, he was just like, there was just space, you know. So, but then I saw this magazine interview he did in a San Francisco magazine, and he was talking about me and the tape that I had sent him of the Black Page, and I couldn't believe it. I'd never really even seen my name in print, you know. And there it was, Frank Zappa talking about me. It was really cool.
So how much later was you actually joining the band? When did he decide that you're actually old enough to come and do this with us now?
Well, he didn't. What happened was the day after, a couple of days after my 20th birthday, I moved to California, and I moved right down the street from him. And
Not stalking him at all.
Yeah, and I just started going up to the house, and once you start going up to the studio, you know, Frank will just, if you have something to offer, he'll just suck you in, and you end up recording all this stuff, and that's what happened.
Incredible stuff. And that must have been kind of dream come true moment sort of thing for you, surely.
I was scared to death. I mean, I was very young, and it just seemed surreal.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, next thing I know, I'm in Frank's studio, and there's Vinnie Colaiuta and Terry Bozzio and Tommy Mars, and I'm like, wow. And he's giving me all this wild music to record. And then and I'm just, it was fun because they were fun guys to hang out with.
Yeah.
You know, Frank was just kind of amazing just to sit and talk with, because he would always, he was a great conversationalist. He always had an opinion about things, and he always, gave you his attention, and he listened when you spoke.
Okay.
You know, so and he was always interested and interesting.
Yeah. So obviously at this point you were a fantastic guitarist already. You had Frank spewing words of praise about you, so that was down. But what else did you learn from Frank? I mean, thinking of live shows, did you learn anything about stage presence when you were touring with Frank, or anything like that?
Well, being a musician in Frank's band required certain tools, and there wasn't it wasn't the kind of band you get into to learn how to perform. Say you learn how to play high information music under pressure while laughing. And you had to keep your attention on Frank at all times. You know, I couldn't really play to the audience, you know, because Frank was conducting certain things. He, at any time during the entire show, he could give you a signal. He had various signals he would give you that would mean do this in a song. You know, if he went like this, that meant whatever you were playing, play it reggae. or he would go like this, which meant ska. Then it was he would go like this, that'd be the roster dreads.
Yeah.
So you play whatever you're playing, you turn it into reggae. Or he'd go like this, and whatever you're playing, you got to play it in 5/8. Or he had this one really great one where he'd walk around, he'd go like this, and that meant whatever you were doing, play it heavy metal. Big balls.
Yeah.
You know. So you really had to keep your eye on Frank, and we did probably 2 shows a night most of the time, with long sound checks where he would write and record. And then we had about 80 songs that you had to have memorized. And he would pick the set list. He would write the set list 5 minutes before the show. And it was different every single night. So it was a real challenge for someone like me, because I used to, for some reason, I had a fascination with playing the very complex lines on the guitar, you know?
Yeah.
So Frank finally had a guitar player that he could give all these very challenging, dense, melodic lines to. And they were all written. I mean, Sinister Footwear was like 20 pages of sheer terror, you know? So probably about 60-70% of those 80 songs were sheer terror. And I had to practice them constantly because I don't know, you know, the guitar is just a hard instrument to play that stuff on. And the way my mind worked, I couldn't, you know, you can't just learn something like that and then leave it for 5 days and then go, oh, okay, yeah, he put Sinister Footwear on the set list. Let me play. You know, it didn't work that way. You had to play that shit all the time. So you wake up at 9 a.m. and you go to the airport and you fly to the gig, and then you get from the car and you go directly to the gig and you do a long sound check, and then you have 45 minutes before the first show, and then there's 45 minutes before the second show. And by the time you get, you know, we got back to the hotel, it was 2:00, 1 or 2 a.m. And I had to practice because I don't know what songs he was going to call the next night.
Man.
So it, you know, I deteriorated pretty quickly.
Yeah, I can imagine. That sounds incredibly intense, especially for someone so young and fairly new to the music business world as well. And it's not a kind of regular set. You're going to play the same 12 songs in a night and you know what the encore is going to be. And it just sounds so challenging, but at the same time, an incredible grounding for you, because nothing that kind of follows that could surely be anywhere near as difficult.
No, nothing. There was nothing. There's nothing. I don't know if there's anything in the business like that. Because Frank's music was so complex, but I loved it too, because Frank's music, I just loved it. You know, some of it is so profoundly beautiful. I mean, take a song like Sofa or Redunzo. These are beautiful melodies to play. And I was young, so I had a lot of energy in a sense. You know, I wasn't afraid of anything. I may have been a little intimidated and nervous and naive around Frank because he was Frank Zappa. But when it came time to play in the music, I'm like, okay, shovel it on, brother, because I got this.
Fantastic.
I was really cocky and really confident, brutally confident.
Best way
but
to be.
You have to have that. You have to have that with Frank, because there's no messing around.
Yeah, absolutely. And after a couple of years with Frank and touring and living that kind of really intense lifestyle, you then went off and you built your own studio, didn't you, with your own bare hands, which is pretty incredible for your first solo record, Flexible. I mean, that's an incredible thing to do in terms of crafting your building as well.
Yeah, that was a dream come true. You know, the fascinations when sometimes you don't recognize these things till later in life. But the real fascination for me in my career, since you have a kind of some periods of time to look back at, I always lit up first and foremost with the idea of composing, writing music. I wanted to understand that language since I was 5 years old. You know, I wanted to own it, and I wanted to be able to wield it. And then after that, oddly enough, it was recording, because I understood it's 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. I understood the concept of recording, but there was something about the process that fascinated me in my mind. And of course, there was the fascination with the guitar, but I didn't consider playing the guitar because it seemed so out of my reach. It was such there was so much of a mystique to it. It stunned me every time I would look at a guitar. So it always seemed like, well, you're not good enough for that.
Wow.
But then when my sister came home with Led Zeppelin, 2, and I heard that record, especially Heartbreaker. And when I was about 11 or 12, that was it. I had to play the guitar. And then, as fate would have it, my friend sold me a guitar he had for $5, and that kicked things off for me. But obviously, my perspective of recording was greatly enhanced once I started working with Frank, and I was in, I would watch him very carefully. He showed me how to edit tape. Once I learned how to edit tape, that was it. The first thing I bought when I had any money was a 4-track TIAC 4-track tape recorder, and I just recorded everything. And it was in a little apartment in Fairfax down in Hollywood. But then right after Frank, that's when I built Stucco Blue. And I had just saved enough to put a down payment on a house in Sylmar. And there was a tool shed out back. And I basically, built it out. And it took me 5 months, and it was great fun because I liked building too. Yeah. And then I started to record Flexible.
Incredible.
And then Passion and Warfare. Some of Passion and Warfare was recorded there, and some of Alcatrazz, and some of Dave Roth.
Wow.
Skyscraper. Yeah.
Right, yeah, that's incredible. In terms of Flexible, then, I mean, you released that on your own record label. You started your own record label instead of signing a crap deal with a standard company. I mean, that's a pretty bold move, again, for someone who's fairly young, who didn't have a big back catalogue behind them. How did you come to that decision? And did you ask friends in the business for advice and that kind of thing around that?
I had no real expectations, and the idea of recording a record, I knew I wanted to record. I was recording tons and tons of nonstop recording. But the idea of releasing it and trying to get a record deal and release it, I just didn't want to deal with it. I just didn't want to go out and, would you release my record? No, please. It's just, the music seemed too personal I didn't want to be subjected to anybody else's decision about anything. I just felt in a position of vulnerability if I had to depend on a record company, so, and I was so young and naive. I wasn't desperate at all. I had no desperation to be famous or successful. I just wanted to play the guitar and record these crazy melodies and songs. And the idea of writing music, recording it, and listening to it, that was enough, but then I had all this material, and I had Flexible, and I thought, I wonder if I could, get this printed up so I could send it to some friends. And that's when the Evatone Flexi disc came into my life. And that's just like one of those little plastic, flimsy,
bendy one.
And there was a company called Evatone, and they made them. And I thought, well, I know, I'll be the first one to release a record on an Evatone Flexi disc. And I started to look into it, and there was a lot of limitations to it. And then I thought, well, what the heck? Let me try to see if somebody will release this. And I started shopping it around. And there was one label, Enigma, and they were willing to release it. And the only reason they were willing to release it was because I was an ex-Zappa musician. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I ended up getting a deal from them. And when I read the deal, I was just stunned. It was like a $10,000 advance, and they would own the record, and they'd give me 25 cents a record. And I had to recoup the $10,000 advance from my 25 cents.
Wow.
And I'm like, okay. They saw me coming, some stupid kid. And I took it to my attorney, and he said, no, Steve, this is a conventional record deal, and this is a good one. They're offering you an advance. Most people in your position, they wouldn't offer an advance. I said, yeah, but then they own my record. And he goes, yeah, that's what they do. This is, and 25 cents. He goes, yeah. And I said, fuck that. And I just said no. And because it didn't feel right to me, like I'm not gonna. Why should they get so much more? There's always been another kind of stumbling block in me, and it was always on an economic level. I could never understand why anybody would get paid more than me for my work, and they never have. Not in my career. I've always made sure that managers, agents, anybody, I get paid the most, the end. And if it doesn't work out that way, I just don't do it because it's something, it makes sense. Now, of course, there may be situations where there's a lot of other people involved. And you always, my desire for that, for getting paid the most for my work is that of fairness. Because it's my work. And so many situations are different where, of course, you're splitting something and you're co-creating and things like that. But when it came time to record companies and things like that, I just thought I just didn't want to be taken advantage of. So I did something kind of outrageous. I decided to start my own label. I was 22 years old, because I just started to look behind the curtain, and I'm thinking, well, how do labels work? And the only thing we had to go by back then was like the yellow pages. There was no internet, there was no computers, nothing. But we figured it out. And I noticed that labels support, they have a great function. They pay for everything and they give you the money to make the records. And then they take the record and it becomes part of their equity because labels run great risks, and that's how they build their equity, by owning the masters. But I eventually, and then what they do is they manufacture the records, and these were all vinyl back then, and some cassettes. They manufacture the records, and then they sell the records to a distributor. And the distributor puts it in the stores. The distributor goes around to all the stores and says, hey, you want to buy the... So that was something I learned, and I just thought, well, why don't I go to distributors instead of labels? And I did. And every distributor I called would say, no, we don't take product from artists. We take product from labels. So I started a little label. It cost me $12.50.
Oh, brilliant.
I just went downtown, filed the paper, and, had this little label. It was nothing, it was an envelope, but the envelope had flexible in it, and I found a distributor that was willing to release it because he was a guitar head, Cliff Coltrane at Important Records. And he offered me $4.10 a record, and I retained the rights to the record. Nobody was taking it. And I said, oh yeah, and he took 1,000, and that was a lot of money to me, $4,000. And then he took another 1,000, and then another 1,000, then another 1,000. Then the Attitude song got into Guitar Player magazine, and that was it. I mean, now he's taking 10,000, and then the record was distributed through their partner overseas. So, and then when CDs came out, I retained the same kind of distribution deal. So instead of getting on a good conventional deal, 50 cents a record, a CD from a label, I was getting $7.50.
Wow.
Yeah. And within a period of years, it sold like 400,000 copies.
Wow.
So that was crazy. It was just such a windfall. And I never really, I mean, I like money, but not it never really. I was never one of these guys that went out and bought a lot of things, except musical gear. The one thing I always kind of would spend on is a studio. I always had a studio, but I never really was into. I never did drugs or waste my money on cars. And if you like cars, that's great. But I didn't have any attraction. I just wanted to play my guitar and record. And that's what I did.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. Fascinating stories.
Listen, I want to just mention, I know it sounds like I'm bragging, but the reason I'm telling this story the way it is that young musicians need to understand their independence, and they need to know that they are the boss of them. And that you never need to allow anybody to take advantage of you. And your best weapon is information. Your best defense is to understand how things work. And it's not hard. It's really, it just takes a little bit of looking into, because artists have different kinds of brain muscles than business people. Artists are fascinated with notes, and business people are fascinated with dollars, and that's fine. You need both, or they're fascinated with numbers, and it's good to have both. But all too many times I see the stories of people who got banged, artists that got banged through their career. And sometimes they believe they did, but they actually didn't, because they just didn't understand how some of the numbers work. So the reason I'm even telling this story, I made a lot of mistakes in the business. I made my share of mistakes for sure. And I learned from them. But it's important to just do a little homework to understand what is the equity of a musician. Like what, because you got to keep things balanced. It's nice. You could live very simply. I always just lived below my means a little bit. So if I was making, $200 a week giving guitar lessons, I figured out how to live on $180 a week. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I always thought that was important, and that's why I share the story. And when Yngwie Malmsteen hit the scene, he blew us all away. I mean, he floored us. And when he was leaving that band, I thought, well, there's opportunity. And I auditioned for the band. I didn't think I was going to get the gig because I didn't sound anything like Yngwie. When he would sing, I just couldn't believe it. The power that came out of his voice, out of his mouth, it was pretty stunning, because before that, I had never been involved with a singer like that. So when Dave Roth came along, it was an opportunity to kind of stretch that rock and roll muscle. And we kind of resonated well, because he has an obsidian, he has kind of a bizarre sense of quirky humor. And so do I, Dave with Edward was so beloved by so many people. Who's this other guy? And he's no Edward, whatever goes on. But I really paid no attention to that, because I loved the way Edward played, but I wouldn't want to play like anybody else but me. Their Whitesnake album that sold 25 million copies, it came out, and it was a great record. And I just love great singers. And Coverdale was a monster. I mean, come on, I watched that guy get on stage every night and deliver like a boss,